Welcome today as we have our very first episode where we'll look into what is government, what it is to be governed, and what is governance. Now with me today, I have right here beautiful people from the University of Botswana, an expert in political science and one in public administration who happens to be my boss actually. So please help me welcome Dr. Bashimutuse from the Department of Political and Administrative Studies at the University of Botswana, and also Simologo Matlaga, who will help us dissect the issue of governance and how does it relate or how does it link to issues of service delivery, issues of corruption, issues of community development, participation, basically livelihoods. How do we do these things? A re suge rute gore wena wa le Motswana o tshwanetse go dira eng, ditshwanelo tsa gago ke eng le maikarabelo a gago ke eng ga go ta mo governance in Botswana. So, what is government and why do we need government? Dr. Muthuse.
Well, one may start with a very simple definition of government that is provided by an American scholar called Donald Kettle. Mm-hmm. And he defines government as the structure and functions of public institutions.
Okay.
So his argument is that we are focusing mainly on public institutions, public organizations, how they are structured, their main responsibilities, and how they are supposed to be managed. Mm-hmm. And as you know, the government has three branches. There's the executive, which is made up of the president, the vice president, ministers, and assistant ministers. And then there's the legislature or the parliament, and then there's the judiciary.
Okay.
And all these three branches of government play different roles, or they have different responsibilities. The executive is there to formulate and implement policies, and policies are tools that are used to address the needs and the demands of citizens. And then the parliament, as we know it, is there to make laws. The judiciary interprets the laws made by parliament, as well as settle disputes amongst citizens.
Yeah. Okay, so when we have the three branches, why then do we always sing we must have a separation of powers in Botswana? Does that mean a separation of powers? Say, the way we are.
So the principle or the idea of separation of powers is that you don't want to have any arm of government essentially having too much power.
Okay.
And so the whole idea is that if you separate those powers, then it means that every branch of government has a certain function that they perform. And even built into that, it means that every branch of government is also checking each other. So there's this idea of checks and balances on each other.
Yeah.
You know, the executive can't just make their own, decisions. They should be checked by the legislature, etc. So, I think in Botswana, the main contention is that in a system where you have a very neat separation of powers, you don't have an overlap of personnel. So it means that people who are in the executive, for example, will not also be in the legislature. So that's a very clean separation of powers. Whereas in Botswana, the situation is that it's not as clean as in some other systems like the US. So what that then means is that you have members of the executive also sitting in the legislature. And that also, I think, is where the problem comes, because people then say, well, that isn't a very neat separation of powers, one. And in the Botswana system, the argument is that the executive actually dominates. So in as much as, the legislature is meant to actually check the powers of the executive, because of the way our system is structured, it means that the executive often, dominates the system. So that's, I think, where a lot of the contention lies.
Yeah. But so from a public administration point, why would that be a problem where you have the executive dominating even legislation in parliament?
It is problematic in the sense that the executive is supposed to formulate and implement policies, as I said earlier on, all types of policies in all sectors of the economy. And the legislature is one of the important actors that influences the policy process. But remember, the legislature is made up of people who are elected after every 5 years.
Yes.
And they have a responsibility. They are answerable to the electorates. And therefore, they are expected to also perform their roles, their responsibilities to the best of their ability, without necessarily being viewed as a department under the executive. Botswana, if you look at our parliament, it is not 100% independent in the sense that it is treated as a department under the office of the president. The budget, manpower, and all the resources that are needed by the parliament are allocated from the office of the president. And that, in my view, and in addition to what my colleague said, compromises the independence of the legislature.
So, Simoloch, I can call you Simoloch, right? So, Simoloch, now going back to what Dr. Muthusi just said about compromising the independence of the legislature, why is it important that when we sing the song, Parliament must be independent? Why is it important that it's not viewed as being anti-government?
I think it shouldn't be viewed as being anti-government because you want to have a system where essentially it's just like if you're working in a company. Every company has separate departments, and the people in that department or in those departments have their roles. It's very clear, and so for it to function properly, you can't have one department encroaching on the work of another. And I think the key issue here is that if we don't have this very neat separation, or because you do have systems where there is that overlap, but then there should be structures and systems in place that allow for those checks and balances to happen a lot more effectively. So I think even if there's a system where there's an overlap, it's do the checks and balances actually allow for effective checking and balancing? One, I think secondly also you don't want to have a legislature that feels like it just rubber stamps the decisions already made by the executive, because in that sense, if you're having that, then the legislature is actually meant to be representing Botswana because they've been voted for, put in that office by Botswana. But if those decisions that they make at at legislative level, they feel like they've already been made somewhere else and you are just being informed, so to speak, then it means that even your job as lawmakers, because our parliament are lawmakers, their role is to make the laws that essentially govern our country. And so if the very laws that they're making, it feels like they don't have full participation, or they aren't fully able to make decisions in terms of lawmaking, but they're simply just, as I said, rubber stamping decisions made by the executive, then I think that also then puts in issues of accountability, checks and balances that allows things like corruption to happen. And I think it silences the voice of the opposition, particularly in the legislature.